We are now live, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our first of many events in the context of our project on 10 years on mass protests and uprisings in the Arab world. My name is Bassam Haddad. I'm one of the two co organizers of this project, along with 16 other units and organizations that are co sponsors. The other co-organizer is Amaney Jamal, who represents the Arab Barometer at Princeton University. I represent the Arab Studies Institute and the GMU, George Mason University's Middle East and Islamic Studies program. We have all sorts of material to share with you, but given the limited time we have today, with eight people representing their institutions, but speaking on their individual, basically speaking as individuals, not as institutional representatives. I just wanted to clarify that we've invited the co-sponsors to address our audience during these first two panels, and the second panel will take place at 2:30 p.m. So we have about 90 minutes. So I will be a bit brief in both introducing the project and introducing the speakers with a byline that will also be listed under in the feed, in the Facebook feed. Um, I also would like to share that the list of our sponsors or co-sponsors or the collaborators that produce this 1 year long project will also be listed in the Facebook feed, and that will be a place where people can go through the units. One more thing of interest to so many is we are broadcasting obviously on Facebook. However, there will be a YouTube version for those who do not have Facebook that will be published in the next 48 hours, and we will advertise this widely. And henceforth, we are planning on broadcasting simultaneously to both Facebook and YouTube so people can watch the panel live. Um, so today, or the first of the 10 or 12 panels that are going to take place in the coming months, as well as many other lectures and book talks and roundtables that will take place around those what we call signature monthly panels. Today, we decided to start with a panel or a set of two panels on reflections on the mass protests and uprisings in the Arab world. And these are intended to address the question of commemorating or marking the Arab uprisings. How do we do that? And as well as addressing some of the or highlighting some of the important aspects of the uprisings, as well as what has been given short shrift, what has not been addressed properly by the literature, the media, and beyond regarding the Arab uprisings. So, without saying much more, I would like to start with our first panelists. We have eight panelists today. I will be moderating the panel, the presentations, and the discussion if we have time. Indeed, I will be asking our panelists to stop at 10 minutes sharp. I will sound some sort of audio or even vocally interfere at 8 minutes to give a 2 minute warning. And then at 10 minutes, I will rudely interrupt in order for us to service everyone and probably leave some room for discussion. So we will start with the first speaker today, and this is Ahmad Dallal. He is the Dean of Georgetown University in Qatar. Welcome, Ahmed. There will be a fuller list of bios that will be listed on the uprisings on the project's websites, which is the arabuprisings.org. The arabuprisings.org. And uprising ends with an S. So it's not the Arab Uprisings, the arabuprisings.org, because I got emails about this. We got emails about this. So with this, I would like to open the floor for Ahmed.
Good evening, Bassam. Good evening, everyone. To you, to the colleagues on the panel, and also obviously to the participants. And thank you, and Amani for organizing this, for assembling this consortium to discuss this extremely important topic, and for giving me the opportunity to be part of tonight's conversation. It's 9:09 now, so you start counting from 9:09. So I have till 9:19, Bassam. Over the last 10 years, there has been a dramatic change in the way we think, I think, about the wave of revolutionary protests and uprisings that swept across the Arab world. Or to be more specific, perhaps in the way in the questions that we ask with regard to these uprisings. Initially, I think many of us were excited to witness the sheer scale of change. And for those of us who are old enough, who've been through many defeats and so on, we were extremely excited to see that finally something is happening. Then and now, I think we cannot underestimate the import of what happened. Dictators that ruled for decades and seemed invincible fell. And I think it's important to keep this in mind, despite all of the setbacks that I'm sure many of us will talk about. Along with hope and enthusiasm that swept through the whole region, one of the first questions that many asked was, how come no one anticipated this change and see it coming? There was surprise at many levels. There was, of course, surprise amongst us, pundits, academics, experts. There was surprise among the ruling elites themselves, and I think to some extent this explains the quick capitulation of the first group of rulers, whereas now rulers actually don't give up as easily. And I think there was surprise among the protesters themselves at their own power and ability to affect change on this large scale. Despite these surprises, however, I think the uprisings did not come from nowhere. Numerous studies have described the problems of the region, even if they did not predict these specific outcomes. The protracted social struggles, I mean, pretty much the whole 20th century is a century of a sequence of struggles throughout the Arab world, and many forms of resistance. In their own right, these struggles and these forms of resistance reflect confidence that change is possible, even if not, again, at the scale that the uprisings triggered. So it is possible to think of the 2011 uprisings as continuations of historical struggles, but of course with their unique historical traits. To think of them as culminations of sorts, although not ultimate conclusions of these struggles, if there is ever an ultimate conclusion of any struggle. And in a way, with the hindsight of history, those who never gave up on struggling on the side of human dignity must have hoped to achieve something. Otherwise, they wouldn't have bothered. So in a way, we could, their struggle is a form of anticipation, although again, not at the scale that we witnessed. After the initial reactions, there was speculation on what factors of strength were unique to these protest movements, these specific protest movements, that made them succeed where earlier ones failed. And as challenges began to surface, many of us started to speculate on the context of these challenges and the best ways to deal with them. Then gradually, as these challenges intensified, we began to ask what might cause these movements to fail and what is needed for them to succeed. Of course, in many cases, the inability to predict the monumental outcomes of the uprisings, this inability was itself connected to a political and academic discourse that asserted that due to deeply rooted cultural traits, the region is immune to democracy and change. And now, 10 years later, this argument comes back to haunt us. Once again, many pundits are trying to explain why, due to some deeply rooted cultural traits, the uprisings failed to take root, and why the situation today is in many ways much worse than it was 10 years ago. Much has been said, much has been written about what went wrong. I mean, there is not the Bernard Lewis what went wrong, but the current, what went wrong with the uprisings. There is a huge amount of literature on the subject. And on the surface of it, I think the question makes some sense. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed since the beginning of the uprisings. Millions were displaced. Human rights violations are now inflicted on scales which are higher than the way they were before the uprisings. And overall, the region, I think one can safely say the region is less free than it was before the uprisings. States are in shambles, many are actually failed states. The region is suffering from economic disasters with increased poverty, increased susceptibility to chaos. Several countries have suffered and continue to suffer from destructive wars. Syria, Libya, Yemen, not to mention, of course, the dragging war in Iraq. Regional conflicts have intensified with more wars and conflicts on the horizon and no signs of resolving any of the major regional conflicts. Increased vulnerabilities to external powers. I mean, one need only think of the most recent role that Jared Kushner played in orchestrating a regional alliance. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic was the last straw on a situation, of course, which is extremely bad. In short, dashed dreams, with the exception of Tunisia, that we all are attaching so much hope on this single fragile model of Tunisia. For Tunisia, the burden that Tunisia has to carry. Now, of course, in 2019, there is a new wave of protests. Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, Sudan, and these bring with them new forms of protest, new tools and mechanisms, and this has revived. I think rightly, have revived hope of something positive, of some success. And of course, there has been significant differences in the tools which have been used during 2019, the 2019 protests. As of yet, however, it's not clear what this new wave will produce. But there is no doubt that the protest movements in these countries face monumental challenges. In this wave, there has been a significant change in political setups, no doubt. There has also been more willingness to compromise and avoid violence. But in places like Sudan, the compromises seem to prioritize external interests, which I think, at least on some level, does not bode well for the future. More important, while the protesters are learning and improvising, entrenched authorities are also learning from the experiences in other countries and have the regional and international supporters, and clearly some are willing to fight back in ways that the earlier despots didn't. So in short, there are no guaranteed outcomes despite the renewed optimism. Now, the questions we asked before the tide started to turn evolved. We tried to understand the factors that contributed to the resilience of the uprisings despite several counter-revolutions. We asked if these protest movements should be characterized as revolutions or uprisings, whether they were deliberate political movements with ideologies or with the political direction, with platforms and programs, or spontaneous reactions to long histories of failures. In defense of spontaneity, we argued, many of us argued, that these reactions, which were not filtered through ideologies, were more reflective and responsive to the needs of society. We also argued that the lack of clear leadership and political direction makes it harder to crack down on these protests. Of course, I don't think there is anything fundamentally wrong with these questions.
Ahmed, this is your 2-minute warning. I'm sorry to
yes,
interrupt.
yes,
You asked
I
me to
understand.
interrupt
I
you.
have 1 minute left. I don't think there is anything wrong with these questions. I think these questions I think if we ask the right questions at the right moments, and the questions will continue to evolve depending on the context that we face. I think one of the biggest questions, the questions that we need to continue to ask, and from my perspective, this is the primary question that one needs to ask about the various forms of protest or uprising or whatever we want to call it, is what are the tools and mechanisms that will make these changes last? In other words, what are the tools and mechanisms that will enable these revolutions, these uprisings, to survive the transition? Because this is where things went wrong. It's during the transition. It's the inability to deliver good governance. It's the inability to create large-scale alliances within the countries. It's because of the severe polarization that has plagued not only the region, but also the movements themselves, and so on and so forth. It's the inability to come up with the appropriate mechanisms and techniques to deal with the very deliberate attempts by states to militarize the conflict, and so on and so forth. So I think the primary question, the primary broad question, is what are the tools what are the lessons that we could learn from the earlier successes. This said, I think we cannot underestimate the monumental changes that have happened during the uprisings 10 years ago. Thank you.
يعني على اللحظة exactly 10 minutes. This is remarkable. Thank you, Ahmed. I apologize for interrupting at the 2-minute mark, but it seems that the video will not work if I, put a sign or do something. So I might be just sounding the alarm at 9 minutes. This way, you literally have 1 minute to finish, because I don't want to interrupt you too early and need to give you like a minute to finish your last words. Before we proceed, I would like to ask my co-conspirator and partner in crime, which we've been using this language, Amaney Jamal, if you have anything to say before we proceed.
No, that was great. I mean, in terms of
And basically, in terms of introductions, I actually should have asked you earlier, but I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything.
oh no, this is great, and thank you everyone for joining. And I look forward to hearing everyone's talk and getting it out there, and then also chiming in later today. But thank you, Bassam.
Absolutely. And you're speaking today as the last speaker, so people will hear from you later on as well. Let me say that the next person is Asli Bali. She is professor of law at UCLA School of Law and faculty director of the UCLA Law Promise Institute for Human Rights. So if you would take the floor, Asli, we are all ears.
Sure. Thanks so much, Bassam, and thanks to you and Amaney again for organizing this compelling year-long series, but also this opportunity to reflect together as an opening. I really appreciate being included. And I thought what might be helpful for my 8 minutes or so would be to think a little bit about the sort of politics of marking the uprisings, one of the questions I know we're grappling with as a group. And many of the narratives that have emerged about this decade marker were already prefaced in Ahmad Dallal's excellent comments. And I just want to note some of them. Even today, you could open the Washington Post and read about the lost decade, this idea of mainstream narratives that understand the story of the uprisings 10 years on as primarily a failure, or a story of regional turmoil, endless destabilization, a focus on displacement, the refugee crisis, and so forth. I think it's incredibly important to resist these ways of understanding the region that carry on a long tradition of pathologizing, and instead focus on, first, what is it that we need to think about when we mark a moment like this one? What does the marking itself mean, which I'm going to say a little bit about? And then what has been missing from the analysis that we can learn from and that we can build on as we think about, the next period as we study these unfolding events. So to begin with, what might we think about in marking the moment? The first is the challenge of temporality and periodization to begin with. The idea that we speak of 10 years on or a decade offers, the sort of mainstream, if you want, public, an idea that there's a snapshot that you can take of the region, that there's a moment that occurred, and now we mark time that has passed since that moment, instead of something more akin to a longue durée, a process that is ongoing and unfolding, that is both continuous and situated in exactly the ways that Ahmed suggested in his comments. So I think in thinking about 10 years on as a framing, we ourselves have to grapple with this question of temporality and periodization and think about how we discuss that fact, the fact of the sort of passage of 10 years without reifying these snapshot ideas that the uprisings were this one window of opportunity that emerged and closed. And now we've gone from the sort of loathed Arab Spring framing back into a long winter, which is again, a very common way of framing the thinking about the decade that's elapsed. Another question is defining the region itself. So it's been 10 years, of course, since the uprisings that began at the end of December 2010 in Tunisia and carried on through the Arab world. But it's been 12 years since the Green Movement emerged in Iran. It's been 8 years since the Gezi protests exploded in Turkey. And the region as a whole is facing a series of structural constraints that have continuities that we might want to think about in ways that expand our lens of how we define the region and what period it is that we're looking at. And that also suggests that there's the challenge of what is continuous and what is a disjuncture. So 2011 represented a set of ruptures. There's no question about that. And I think the more interesting ones we might think about as a group are the ruptures in the epistemology of the region, of thinking about what we know about the region. And again, here, Ahmad Dallal's comments already prefigure my thoughts, which is that the questions are shifting. And interestingly, it may be that the questions that are being asked in the region are shifting, but there was also a massive challenge to the way interdisciplinary work in the social sciences has conceived of the region when these uprisings emerged. Again, it's been noted that they were not anticipated. That very failure generated a kind of epistemological crisis. And one response to that crisis has been to return to earlier narratives and demonstrate that they were right. Persistence of authoritarianism, retrenchment, the failure to translate movement activism or bottom-up events in the region into actual change and so forth. We need to really question the way in which that recovered epistemology has re-entrenched itself. And we also have to think critically about the pedagogy of the region and how we've expanded it. And it has expanded enormously, largely thanks to the work of people included on this panel and the next one. But how to turn that set of experiments and thinking differently pedagogically about the region into a broader pedagogical program. I think that's an important idea that we might embrace in marking this anniversary. And then there are some basic conceptual questions about how to imagine the relationship between our current moment, what preceded the decade that we've just experienced, and what has elapsed since, whether they are questions about how to situate events that, again, Ahmed mentioned in 2019 from Iraq and Lebanon to Sudan and Algeria, or just more generally, how to understand what represents a critical juncture, where we see path dependency emerging, what new paths have arisen. And this allows me to sort of pivot to the second set of questions that I think we should turn to, which is what has been missing in the literature that has engaged with the uprisings to date. And there are many things that are present. So one thing that I would note, and as Bassam mentioned, I'm running a human rights institute at a law school at the moment, is the centrality of human rights and narratives of inclusion in the uprisings, which defy longstanding sort of accounts of the region as trailing behind or somehow lost or outside of mainstream frames of human rights. Quite to the contrary, I think one could argue that certainly in the events of 2010-11 and since, the region is really at the vanguard of defining what a true understanding of human rights, which renders civil and political rights interdependent and indivisible from economic and social rights, means when you have that turn into grounded knowledge that foregrounds things like bread, freedom, and social justice as much as it does questions of freedom of speech or assembly or what have you. And of course, we have not just the events in Iraq, Lebanon, Sudan, and Algeria, but things like the Great March of Return, demands for justice for detainees across the region, solidarity work around migration and displacement, just practices that have emerged on the ground that we should really attend to in the human rights literature. But I want to think a little more broadly in the last couple of minutes I have, and Bassam, just to preempt you, I'm well aware that I have less than 3. I think that the real challenge for us in thinking about knowledge production 10 years on about the region is treating these uprisings as a generative moment in their own right that can be part of a broader conversation about decolonizing knowledge production in the social sciences. And I just want to say a little bit about what I mean by that. The traditional categories of analysis that are drawn from the experiences of the West or the global North are just not adequate to describe or analyze the global experience of politics as a whole. And we need to move away, in my view, from interpretations of political developments in the region that foreground crises, absences, and failures, and move away from models that presume a teleology that requires replication of past processes in the West, modernization, democratization, and so on, to break the habit of treating non-replication of these processes as somehow itself pathological. And that, I think, in a word, summarizes an enormous swath of all the analysis of the uprisings. They were part of a prophesied fourth wave of democratization. The Middle East would be the fourth region for replication. The failure to do so is the crisis. Just getting away from that entire set of paradigms and thinking instead in a situated way about the region and its post-uprising politics as a research domain in itself, bringing analytic focus to the political histories and predicaments of the region away from these pre-existing categories and the intellectual and political traditions of the region as having explanatory force in and of themselves. This isn't that we shouldn't do comparative work, of course we should, but we should situate the comparison in thinking about the ways in which concepts, repertoires, and frameworks from the uprisings are themselves globally situated and globally generative, that they represent their own disjuncture in the way we should be thinking about the region and about our work. And they enable us to think differently in interdisciplinary literature by trying to identify what is distinctive about the uprisings as a generative site for conceptual innovation that has explanatory power for us, for the region, and transregionally. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Asli. Everyone's keeping to time. Maybe I'm not going to do much with any disciplinary sort of behavior. Before we move on, I just heard and myself checked that our website, thearabuprisings.org, might have been attacked. And it's showing that when you go to it now, on some browsers, that you should be aware that this website has problematic, I don't know, malware, whatever. Just ignore it, because I think that is a hack. The website is fine, and it doesn't have any problematic material other than what you are hearing today. All right, we will now move to the third speaker, and this is Rochelle Davis, who is an associate professor of cultural anthropology in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. Rochelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'm really grateful to be here and to be part of all of this. It's super exciting to really go in depth on an issue with colleagues of this who know so much about all of these things. And so thank you, Amaney and Bassam, for including me, and thank you to all of my colleagues here for their generosity as we continue these conversations and learn from each other. I'm going to talk about two things that I think are crucial questions that we have, or issues that we have not done a great job of sort of delving into. And so I'm going to go straight into them. The first one, I think, is really one of the most important aspects of studying these uprisings, is not only all of the issues that my colleagues have brought up, but really is the way in which certain regimes have taken hold and become entrenched, and the various types of violence that they are willing and able to enact on their populations. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about, sort of cultural paradigm a la Huntington's, civilizational model, or, talking about Asian tigers or something, but rather in thinking about the ways that Ahmad Dallal described in his opening talk. And, much blood has been spilt in the violent repression of the uprisings' calls for participation in governance, freedom, and equality, or in the words of the protesters, "Aish hurriya wa adala ijtimaiya." And those who've participated in the uprisings, I think, really deserve longer-term analysis of the ways in which power and violence was used to squash or neuter those calls and the popular movements that developed. And I think it's really the work of those who have laid bare some of those structures and dynamics that gives us a window into the power to squelch the dissent. And I'm thinking of the work of somebody like Zainab Abul-Majd, who wrote first in Jadaliyah in December of 2011, and later in her book about the army and the economy in Egypt. And she details for us the ways in which the economic productivity of Egypt was really deeply imbricated with the military control of the country. And I think paying closer attention to work like hers back in 2011 and 2012, and even today, would suggest some of the ways to understand how the constituents who had major political and economic structural interests in returning to power might come back, as indeed they did. And I'm also thinking of the work by people like Diana Bashur, who wrote also in Jadaliyah. She produced this amazing piece called "What the West Owes Syrians: US and European Arms Sales to the Middle East 2011 and 2014. And she noted that just 1 year after the Arab uprisings, the EU and US licensed arms sales to the region increased by 22% and 300% respectively. So it is, to me, essential that we make these connections between those countries who support the entrenchment or re-entrenchment of repressive regimes and the weapons trade through understanding global arms sales and that this must be part of how we analyze the staying power of the repressive regimes 10 years on, or if not their staying power, at least their ability to maintain regimes of violence and repression, which is not just a local or regional issue, but works to the benefits of these major arms selling countries in the world. A number of populations have experienced violence at such levels, of course, that they've been displaced all around the globe. And I'm here thinking particularly of both Syrians and Yemenis. And one way that the discourse about the uprising takes shape when it is connected to the massive waves of displacement post-2011 is, as Asli Bali described, in a framing that removes any relationship between the displacement and the political and economic benefits that accrue to those selling the weapons that get used to enact the violence that that result in the displacement. And so I really think we need to make these larger global connections. And Bashur in her article refers to the quote unquote burden that Europe expresses about taking on and hosting refugees. And she says it is, quote, making their taxpayers shoulder the short-term cost of hosting refugees in exchange for profits to the arms industry. And so I think there are ways that we need to think in some ways more globally about the actual structural ways in which we know what has happened 10 years on. I want to talk about my second issue, and I'm going to try and share a slide or two. So, and that is, I'm going to move to something a little bit more positive, or at least it makes me feel more happy. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Sorry, it's going to take a second. You can see that, but then I can't see my notes, right? Can you see that? Yeah, okay. So I think it's really useful to think about the incredible cultural production that was unleashed by the graffiti and the mobilizations of the Arab uprisings. And that took shape of artwork, street graffiti, music, spoken word, signage, poetry, and then later films, novels, graphic novels, all of these things took on new forms and they resonated with the spirit and sort of the life of the age. There were, let me go up to, trying to change my slide and this is just way too difficult. The streets really were, as we think of sort of the salons or the diwans and the forums in which the creative expressions of people inspired by each other and inspired each other and, you know, put forward ideas about different kinds of futures. And this cultural production cannot be separated from the incredible protest organizing that made it possible for people to be in the streets and to unseat regimes. And thus it reflects both the organizing that happened as well as the spontaneity of people in conversation with each other through and via these cultural expressions. The material produced was beautiful, commemorative, humorous, silly, and very, very deep on other kinds of levels. And it has both an ephemeral spirit as well as one that we can hold on to today. And that ephemeral spirit was experienced and became part of the people who participated in the uprisings and who, despite the brutality of the responses to their demands, continued to call for change. Because at least some of this cultural production was recorded, it then reverberated digitally across much wider spaces than the streets and squares where it was created. And in the face of all that has happened, we must note that this cultural production continued and continues in spite of the violent crackdowns on people and restrictions to public space and expression, etc. At the same time, the ancestors who overthrew colonial regimes and monarchies and other forms of repression were also summoned as part of this cultural expression and revolutionary histories. And this piece of artwork is the opening lines of Abul Qasim Shabi's poetry from the 1930s, coming back in 2011 in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria. And this is a Syrian, so that piece of calligraphy actually says, إِذَا الشَّعْبُ يَوْمًا أَرَادَ الْحَيَاةَ فَلَا بُدَّ أَنْ يَسْتَجِيبَ الْقَدَرُ. Or you can think of Syrians spray painting Sultan al-Atrash's face on the walls as if summoning him and recalling his leadership in the struggle against Ottoman forces and French colonial officials. Because we live in a digital age, more of the cultural production of the revolution has been preserved than perhaps in any other time in history in places like the webpage of the Creative Memory of the Syrian Revolution, or in the American University in Cairo's Politics and Revolution Archive, among many other sorts of places. And we can, of course, think of them as archives, but we also might be well served by thinking of them in some ways as a digital sort of modern lieu de mémoire, a site of memory, as Pierre Nora might have us think in 21st century form, where these cultural products capture the spirit of the moment, of the time of revolution, and in ways that other forms do not, and from which we can derive inspiration and learning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rochelle. Everybody is sticking to time, and this is good news because it allows us to have some conversation. Next, I would like to move to the Ziad Abu-Rish, who is director of the MA program in Human Rights and the Arts at Bard College. Ziad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bassam, and thank you, Amaney, for all the work you guys have been doing in organizing this and everything else. And it's a pleasure and honor to be on this panel with other colleagues and comrades, if I may. Also, a very difficult task to go after Ahmad, Asla, and Rochelle because of how much ground they've already covered. So allow me to modify some of my prepared remarks to just speak directly to the two main prompts, to reiterate some points, but also perhaps add a few others. One, in terms of the politics of marking the uprisings. I think we're struggling with many of the same questions, marking 10 years on, that many on this panel and elsewhere had alluded to very early on, actually, is are the uprisings a single event, or are they a variety of events that we are narrating as a single event? And then the question of temporality, of course, is also very important. Not just vis-a-vis 2010 onwards, but also the relationship of the last 10 years to previous periods. How unprecedented or not unprecedented were these mobilizations, and the politics of the uprisings. Is what happened in Algeria, Sudan, and Lebanon a round two of the uprisings, or is it the continuation of the uprisings? Are the uprisings over in certain countries like Egypt and Tunisia, or are they not? I think these are a lot of the issues with marking the uprisings that we're wrestling with, and that are actually under the surface of a lot of the writing that I think has come out in the last 6 months, by the way, that's not being explicitly addressed, but seems to mark certain differences between how people are addressing these issues. Finally, with regards to the politics of marking the uprisings, I'd like to just attend to the fact that I think there's also actually a struggle over defining what the uprisings were. Not just in terms that I think Asla and Ahmed pointed to very well, the question of failure or non-replication as failure, so to speak, but also whether these were democratic uprisings, whether these were uprisings around political economy and social justice, whether they were both. I think those struggles are actually playing out in how the uprisings are being written about. You do have scholars that are emphasizing individual rights and questions of democratic governance far more than they're emphasizing questions of political economy and social justice, and in many ways picking sides over the very battle that I think is going on in Egypt and elsewhere around the world, around the Middle East, sorry, and the world, in terms of what was it that happened on January 25th? What was it that happened on February 14th? What was it really about? And I think Hisham Salam has an excellent article on Jadaliya that started to point out about the struggle over narrating what the uprisings were about. So I think these are some of the issues that we're still wrestling with regards to the politics of marking the uprising, that I would hope that we could be a little bit more explicit in our writings and in our discussions not to make them necessarily the focal point, but just to be clearer on where people are standing on these analytic issues that I think are very important and speak to a variety of dynamics. Let me move on to the second set of points, which has to do with what did we find most interesting, or what do we think has received a short shrift, so to speak, as one email put it. Here, allow me to highlight a couple of points. One, building on what Asla pointed out, I think questions of how knowledge production has shifted is really important, not just epistemologically with regards to the social sciences and interdisciplinary approaches to the study of the region, but I think we're starting to see some states gain way more attention. I mean, you were hard pressed to find much mention of Algeria or Tunisia in textbooks, history textbooks or other textbooks about the modern Middle East. But after 2011, we started to see many more people try to incorporate those states into their meta-narratives or grand narratives about the Middle East and North Africa. I also think that there was a far smaller group of people that were working on questions of popular politics and protest movements historically and contemporaneously in the Middle East. Now it seems that there isn't anybody that's not working on protests, whether in the past or the present. Now, whether this is good or bad, let's wait and see what the broader scholarship produces. But I think these are important shifts in the production of knowledge that we should attend to. There is a second element of the result of 10 years on, and this is whether we can continue to talk in generic or general terms about authoritarianism in the region. To what point does that broad category of authoritarian regimes hold water, and at what points do we have to get much more specific? I think there are plenty of comparative frameworks that unfortunately did not necessarily hold water in explaining why there were uprisings in some states and not others, why uprisings in some states were more successful than uprisings in other states. And I think this is pushing us to simply move beyond whether they're monarchies or authoritarian republics, whether they were under British or French colonial rule, to actually start to look much more carefully at the institutional, political and economic configurations in specific states to try and understand what happened. This isn't a call, by the way, to critique comparative analysis or comparative frameworks, but a call to push us to be much more specific than I think comparative frameworks had encouraged us to be previously. I'll make two final points with regards to the question of short shrift or most interesting to me. One is the problem of solidarity that I think the Arab uprisings has definitely pointed out. In today's world, in today's time, what does it mean to be in solidarity with a people besieged by an authoritarian regime? And I think for many people, the question of solidarity simply became reduced to whether you call for foreign intervention or you don't call for foreign intervention. Daryl Lee had a really wonderful article about this early on in the uprisings with the question of Libya. But I think the case of Libya, the case of Syria, really brought home the question of what are our menu options for expressing and acting in solidarity? Is it simply to call for or call against foreign intervention? Is that simply what the litmus test of solidarity has been reduced to? I'm not belittling the importance of that question, but I do think we're in a world and a historical moment where we do actually have less thinking and less acting about what solidarity means than might have been available to activists and militants and organizers in previous decades. And finally, and here I'll end with this, one of the most important legacies of what's happened over the last 10 years are the internal struggles and debates that happened within progressive circles and leftist circles in the Middle East. I don't think we should underestimate the legacy of debates about calling on the military to intervene against the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt amongst Egyptian leftists and Egyptian progressives. I don't think we should overlook the question of Hezbollah and the role of Iran in the region in terms of dividing and polarizing certain groups in Lebanon and elsewhere, groups that up until the uprising we're pretty much in agreement on almost everything. And yet, since the uprisings have reached irreconcilable positions as different factions or segments within the progressive circles. This is less something for studying, but I think something that is animating much of what might or might not happen in terms of progressive movements in the Middle East and North Africa, and something we should attend to. And I'll stop with this.
Oh my God, literally on the minute, on the second. I don't know if there's a conspiracy, uh, but this is a good one. This is one of the good conspiracies. Thank you very much, Ziad, and everyone who spoke already. We will now move to Lina Abu Habib, who is the Senior Gender Advisor at the Asli Bali Institute for Civil Society and Citizenship at the American University of Beirut, and as I understand it, is the Interim Director. Lina, the floor is yours.
Shukran. Thank you, Bassam, and thank you, Amaney, for this really timely initiative. I'm very happy to be here. Bassam, if you agree, I'm going to merge the two kind of questions that you posed. My entry point, my point of departure, my perspective is in terms of the feminist framing of the first wave of the uprisings, revolutions, whatever you want to call them, leading to what we've seen in 2019 and until now. And of course, we do agree, all of us do agree that the spark was the fact that enough is enough. Enough is enough in terms of injustice, enough is enough in terms of corruption, nepotism, oppression, etc. But it was also at least for feminist voices, it was enough is enough in terms of gender inequality, in terms of violence against women, in terms of gender-based violence. And for me to be able to continue to my second comment, I need to remind us that actually these voices, these feminist voices, the voices which were very much uncompromising vis-a-vis the regime, which actually pushed back the different regimes at the cost of their safety and security, preceded the uprising. So in Tunisia, I think it's fair to say that the very few voices which were left against the regimes were the few remaining independent feminist organizations, very much so in Egypt as well. So there's somewhere, it wasn't surprising to find these feminist voices actually shaping the messages in the uprisings in the region. Plus the fact, actually, let's look a little bit, and this I want to link it to what happened in Lebanon later on in 2019. These voices have been oppressed by the regime before the regime, during the uprising itself, and also after. So let's remember, for instance, that the first brilliant idea that the new powers that came to Libya was actually, if you remember, the first major, and I see this as incredibly indicative, the first major call was to go back to polygamy. That was the first that was the first narrative. In Tunisia, a place which doesn't know what a female genital mutilation is, again, we see it coming in force after the uprising. In Egypt, all the different reforms which have been hard-earned by the reforms related to the rights of women, which have been hard-earned by women, by women's movement, were called by the Morsi government as Susie's laws, and therefore there is a need to dismantle Susie's laws. So actually, it wasn't a good deal for women and for feminists before, during, and after, and I would argue until now. And also, one of the, again, let me add that my comments are not in a particular order of importance, but also the issue of the systematic forms of oppression against women who dare to be in the public sphere. So sexual harassment, gang rapes, naming and shaming women, talking about what is proper and improper for women to do by all parties, even by the comrades, even by those who were in the uprising shoulder to shoulder. So suddenly the waves of sexual harassment, actually, there's no way that we shouldn't stop and think, what is this phenomenon about? Why is it that every time women are out in the public sphere, the pushback is in terms of sexual harassment? So women were targeted, and this is where I see, really the power of our feminist voices throughout all these processes, because the pushback was very, very, very harsh. But at the same time, so in a sense, we can read it as truly a kind of patriarchal unease of everybody concerned in terms of seeing women in the public sphere and seeing women actually voicing their demands, shaping these demands, and actually asking for their place on the table. And, the rift that we have seen, the shift that we have seen, is that the old argument, the old adage of now is not your time, we will come back to you later, actually wasn't working during the first wave of the uprising or revolution, because it was actually about women reclaiming the public space, and with demands that are specific to the rights of women, to the representation of women, and to women's safety and security from violence. So what did it mean 1 decade down the line? And for me, this is really amazing. The fact that 10 years later, in Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, and Sudan, women immediately became the icons of the different revolution. In each of our countries has actually mostly its woman icon. And I think that's something that we need to, that's something we really need to think about, analyze, and reflect. Why is it that women who have become kind of the poster girls of the revolution, women who themselves were actually attacked, targeted physically through slander, through various forms of harassment? I think that is amazing. But when we came to that point, it wasn't just about women at that point. It was not about women. And at least in the situation of Lebanon, we started seeing a movement that was way more inclusive. So despite kind of the war, all-out war against women human rights defenders, against basically targeting them and killing them, such as the situation in Iraq, for instance, and then bringing back the typical patriarchal gender stereotypes of what is it to be a decent woman, and how you cannot be in the public sphere, how you cannot be a leader, how basically you are not allowed to have a right. We basically shifted from this to having feminist voices, but also voices that were truly oppressed until then. And I mean here, especially in terms of Lebanon, the voices of the queer community. And that, for me, was a turning point, at least in the situation of Lebanon. I want to draw your attention to two things. In the case of Lebanon, we had a kind of a prequel to the 2019 revolution, which was the 2015, the mass protest against the garbage crisis. Something happened in 2015, one small incident, which of course we either don't pay attention to it, or we fail to analyze the importance. There were, at one point, the demonstrations were taking place in front of the Ministry of Environment, whatever that means in the case of Lebanon. And 2 trans women were demonstrating, and they were actually beaten and kicked out by the other people who were demonstrating for exactly the same reasons. You fast forward to 2019, actually the queer community was part and parcel of the demonstration. And the second thing I want to draw your attention with, Human Rights Watch did a beautiful documentary. And I think that's one of the very few that looks a little bit at the narratives, tries to understand why did we have this change? What does the queer community itself, how does it view itself within that context? And the documentary is called If Not Now, When? And one of the women from the LBQ community was saying, that first she was really afraid, and rightfully so, of course, they were afraid. Oh, is that me?
Yep.
Okay.
This is your 1 minute warning, so you do have a minute to conclude.
Sure. And actually what she ended up saying is, this is my revolution as well. And this is what I find powerful, is who claimed the space, who claimed voice, who claimed the revolution. The last point, we have seen shifts that, and I think for us, the question is, how do we create spaces to make these shifts continue? We have seen shifts in challenging, in women, queer community, migrant workers, challenging taboos in relation to the religious establishment, in relation to political and religious figures. And we have seen shifts in the narratives, and this is where I will end, Bassam. Across Beirut, for instance, one of the ways in which the queer community actually reacted to homophobia was through these slogans which said the "Luti mish msabbi," because that was what revolutionaries were actually using to belittle politicians. And these were one of the ways in which the narrative was shifted and the mindset was shifting. The other thing, I mean, in relation to that was the literature that was created by the people themselves, by feminists, by the queer community, which I think for us, I mean, at least for me, that is definitely what I will be looking out for in the coming few months. Thank you. Merci, Bassam.
Ahlan, Lina, sorry, I promised everyone that I will do this, and I was actually very excited that I was able to use it because the others didn't let me. So shukran ilik.
I thought we were having
we
fun.
all owe you, at least I owe you a debt of gratitude, because the word adage كتير أحلى من adage. So thank you for alerting me that there is an adage. Next, we will move to Adam Hanieh, who is a professor in area studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at Exeter University. Ahlan, Adam, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bassam, and thanks, Amaney, and all of the panelists. It's a really great pleasure to be part of this event today. Like everyone, I'm going to speak to 2 points. So I want to begin by speaking around the politics of marking the uprisings, and then secondly turn to some of the questions that I think have been raised and how we should, I think, approach those uprisings. So to begin with the politics, like others, I have been quite frustrated by the way that this 10th anniversary has been covered in recent weeks. Generally portrayed as being a sense of failure, or that it was wrong to protest, come out on the streets at that moment in time. And as with the points made by my fellow panelists, I think that's very much the wrong way of looking at things, that we do need to look much more closely at the underlying reasons and try to understand what has been achieved both at that moment, 2010, 2011, and in subsequent, over the subsequent 10 years. And that, I think, is one of the important factors related to this actual initiative. And I hope through the rest of the year, we'll be able to discuss these matters in greater detail. But I do want to come to the point that Ziad raised around the issue of temporality and how we understand uprisings and the cycles and times of uprisings and resistance. Because I think one of the problems with framing this as something that happened 10 years ago or something that we're marking as an anniversary is we tend to treat it as being a discrete event or something that is over or past. And I really think, if anything, we need to look at those uprisings as something very much with us in the current political conjuncture something very much part of the current moment, an ongoing process that we can see certainly in the wave, what's been described as a second wave that began in December 2018 in Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq. But I think beyond even this, I think there's a problem with the way of describing these as waves of uprising, in the sense that since 2010, there's been a continuous bubble of resistance, bubble of protests, and I think often we draw up these temporal markers based upon when media attention happens to be drawn to the region. And if we look at the last decade, and I'm not just talking here about Egypt, Tunisia, and the kind of star cases of the uprisings, but throughout the region, Palestine, Morocco. Lina has just mentioned the 2015 protests in Lebanon. That there has been a continuous waves of social struggle that belie this kind of way of portraying it as 2010 and then 2018. I think keeping that kind of continuous sense in our mind is really important. And I think, I think the other problem with kind of the way the uprisings have been portrayed as a failure is that it forgets, I think, what the moment we're currently living through, i.e. the pandemic, and what might be coming out of this pandemic. And I do firmly believe that the consequences of this in the region, and we can perhaps talk about this more in discussion, is going to be, both not just in terms of its health effects, but its social, political, and economic implications will be really severe, and I think we will see a resurgence of protest in the wake of the pandemic. And in fact, we're already seeing this, I think, in Tunisia over the weekend. So just to come to the second point around the aspects of the uprising that I found important, or that I think is worth highlighting. Firstly, the point that a number of people have made that this was not simply a question of dictatorship, a question of political authoritarianism, the way that it was framed both in the academic literature, but certainly the way the region and the revolts of 2010, 2011 were framed by political leaders, most notably those Obama, the Obama administration at the time, but also in the media as simply being a question of dictators, long-standing authoritarian elderly dictators. And I think it's very clear, and many people pointed this out at the time of the uprisings, is that we can't separate out the political and the economic spheres in the Arab world and the Middle East as a whole. That the dictatorships that we saw over the last 3 decades were a functional outcome of the way that capitalism, I think, has developed in the region, and particularly through the preceding neoliberal period. So I think one of the very exciting parts of the uprising, one of the legacies that is still with us today, is this kind of return or a renewed attention towards issues of political economy, the understanding that the politics and economics can't be separated, taking questions of class and questions of capitalism seriously, and a focus on labor, and in particular, I think all of this we can see within the contemporary scholarship, and certainly as part of the political movements of the time. I should point out that these patterns haven't, I think this kind of fusing of the political and the economic, and really needing to center the economic restructuring that took place under the authoritarian regimes haven't changed considerably. In fact, they have worsened since 2010, 2011. We've seen the renewed intervention of the World Bank and the IMF. We've seen new forces like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development enter the region for the first time post 2011. And again, just to come back to the protests in Tunisia over the weekend, you know, the slogans on the wall around the revolution of the Hungary, etc., I think really point to this coming together of the political and economic spheres. Relatedly, I think the other aspect of that moment was the fact, and I think this is often forgotten when we talk about the uprisings, is that they were very much close. They were very closely related to the global crisis of 2008, 2009, in the sense that global economic crash had a very significant impact on the Middle East, and it kind of widened or accentuated the polarization within the region, both at the national level but also regionally. And I think, again, to come back to the current pandemic, that it will, the wake of the pandemic, I think, will have a similar effect. So to see the protests of 2010, 2011 as part of a wider global protest, and certainly part of an arc of wider global movements. I guess, wrapping up, because I know I'm running out of time, I just want to turn to the other issue, which I think is really important, certainly in my own research, which is the issue of the regional scale, how we think about the region in the wake of the uprisings and today. And I think Asli's point about how we define the region is really important, that we also need to consider the protest movements in Iran, the Gezi uprisings in Turkey as well, as part of these uprisings. I think one of the things we learnt and is more and more considered today is we need to reject the kind of methodologically nationalist approaches that that divide the region into separate states, take the nation state as the vantage point from which to understand social processes. Instead, I think what we need to really do is think about the regional dynamics, cross-border flows of people, cross-border flows of capital, cross-border flows of ideas, which disrupt these nationally centered ways of viewing the region, certainly disrupt the ways of viewing the political economy of the region. So just to give one example, I think looking, for example, at migration, looking at cross-border refugee movements of people, how we conceive of workers, how we conceive of labor isn't bound simply to citizenship, isn't bound simply to those who exist within the national scale. We also need to think about how migrants, how refugees also are very much part of these class structures through these cross-border movements. And I think also this has something to do with the uprisings themselves, in the sense that national struggles, I think, inevitably grow to confront some of the regional hierarchies that have emerged over the last few decades. And I want to just end on two very brief points. Firstly, again, on this issue of regional hierarchies, I think it's very clear that the Gulf states in particular, despite their differences and despite their own rivalries, have been a major part of the kind of restructuring of the regional political economy. And I think one of the clear features of the last 10 years is that the Gulf has become much more of a consequential actor in the politics of the region, and particularly I think we can see this in relationship Adam. With Israel. So and I think I'll leave it there. Bassam, I've run out of time. Yes.
Sorry about that. Yes.
Yeah.
I tried to do the 9 minutes, but maybe it wasn't loud enough. I apologize. Yeah. Thank you, Adam. I regret doing this because I always want to hear, and I'm sure everybody wants to hear what else we need to say, but we have one more speaker and then we will have almost no time for discussion, because we need to wrap up this panel and move to the next panel. And these panels were not designed to begin with to have a long set of discussions afterwards. There will be, in fact, panels in the future that will be almost dedicated after the presentations are over to actually address these comments by our interlocutors. The next person I'd like to, and the last, and of course not least, person whom I'd like to invite is Rashid Khalidi, who is a professor of modern Arabic studies and director of the Middle East Institute of Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. Rashid, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to Amaney and all of you for doing this. I've been director of that institute for 15 years. I'm not quite sure why this fossil thing lasts on the internet forever, but anyway, not important. I, like everybody else, want to focus on 2 points, and only 2 points today about the uprisings. The first is, I think that we have to understand and we have to study the uprisings and their sequels in something the same way as people study the great upheavals and uprisings across Europe in 1848. In other words, not only in terms of what they did and did not achieve, what the forces that drove the revolutions of 1848 were, but also in terms of the forces that, in the short term anyway, overcame this revolutionary upsurge. Forces of reaction domestically and external forces of reaction, the armies that marched from St. Petersburg, the armies that were sent out by Vienna. And I think we have a similar phenomenon in the Middle East in 2010, both internal and external reaction combined to strangle most of the Arab revolutions in their cradle. The only obvious exception is Tunisia. In the Arab case, as we all know, external forces combined with domestic anti-democratic forces to determine the future of most of the countries where revolution broke out, whether Bahrain, whether Egypt, whether others. Together, they succeeded in either restoring the status quo ante. Military regime in Egypt is almost unchanged from the military regime that's been there since 1952. It's evolved, but it hasn't been transformed. Or failing that, transformed the countries where revolution broke out into devastated landscapes with unending external intervention, proxy wars, civil wars, and massive population displacement. Syria, Yemen, Libya, obviously. These are tragic outcomes that obviously owe a great deal to the regimes in place and their resistance, the Syrian regime's resistance, the Egyptian regime's resistance, but they owe a great deal also to external intervention. And so I see Abu Dhabi and Riyadh as the Vienna, St. Petersburg of the Arab revolutions, playing the role that those two European capitals played in the mid-19th century. I think that these reactionary anti-democratic forces in the Arab world and their external support from the United States, from Europe, and from Israel are actually quite worthy topics of study for anyone who wants to examine the mass protests and the uprisings that shook the Arab world. I think Rochelle in her intervention touched on some aspects of this. The arms sales is part of it, obviously. But I think looking too far afield is a mistake. I think we should look closer afield. I think the role that Arab reaction played domestically in the countries where revolution started and regionally is where we really should be spending a lot of time, and that this is very important to analyze. The second point I want to make is something that I've been thinking about much more in the wake of the uprisings of 2010, and this is how the failure of almost all of the uprisings, how the victory of Arab reaction, domestic and regional, and how the resulting lack of democracy in the Arab world affect the Palestine issue. Obviously, there's no simple answer. These are complicated questions. But I think it can be posited that the undemocratic and unrepresentative nature of most Arab regimes, almost all Arab regimes, with very few exceptions, and their ability to simply ignore domestic public opinion is connected not only to their lack of real support for the Palestine cause, but in many cases to their sabotage of it. Now, I begin from the assumption that Arab public opinion is very supportive of Palestine, which is the result of every opinion poll I've seen by every reasonable institution, whether in the United States or in the Arab world. That doesn't mean that it's the most important issue in the Arab world. I think that in a situation where countries are foundering as they are, where you have failed states, where you have 3 countries with possibly 4 if you count Iraq, ongoing insurgencies and civil wars and external intervention, proxy wars, nobody's going to pay attention to an external issue like Palestine ahead of how do I save my life in Syria, or how do we save our lives in Libya or Yemen or Iraq. Nevertheless, the fact that public opinion is supportive of the Palestine issue, and most Arab governments are aligned with Israel, means that there's a disconnect here. And I'm suggesting that this is one way to look at this disconnect. In and of itself, of course, representative government and democracy are no guarantees that the public's views will be respected. American public opinion turned against wars in the Middle East in the second half of George W. Bush's second term, very soon after the invasion, within a year. The United States has been engaged in those wars ever since. Public opinion has had absolutely no ability to stop those wars. So democracy, whatever kind of democracy you talk about, doesn't guarantee that what the people want is what they're going to get. Nevertheless, in that kind of a system, there are certain possibilities. Of course, democratic systems are susceptible to various forms of intervention, whether we're talking about covert intervention, manipulation of elections, whether you're talking about monetary intervention, bribery, or whether you're talking about overt intervention by external forces. However, if you actually look at the Arab world, those states where public opinion can express itself most freely, countries like Lebanon or Tunisia or even Kuwait, are in fact much less likely to play a role in trying to undermine the Palestine cause than are military dictatorships like Egypt or absolute monarchies like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. Now, in raising these points, I don't mean to downplay in any way the central role either of revolutionary forces and democratic forces inside Arab countries, or the role of their domestic opponents, the reactionary anti-democratic forces inside Egypt and inside different Arab countries. The latter, however, have managed to uphold the status quo, whether we're talking about the army and a chunk of the upper classes in Egypt, whatever the Assad regime in Syria. And important aspects of that status quo have not been changed. As we know, this is a status quo that's marked by a lack of democracy and human rights at home, but also by subservience to the United States, Europe, and Israel abroad. These phenomena obviously antedated the Arab revolutions, and they've survived the Arab Revolution, except, of course, in Tunisia. If anything, I think that that status quo has been strengthened by the outcome of the uprisings, in spite of what has happened in 2018 and 2019, when the status quo was again shaken by popular protest in several Arab countries, Sudan, Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon. I think the strengthening of that status quo has encouraged some governments, like the Emirati government, for example, to go ahead and make public a covert alliance that dates back many, many years. The Emirates' air defenses against missile attack have been insured by Israeli companies for 4 or 5 years. It's not clear how many. Raytheon in Israel, which is an Israeli company, has provided the missile defenses that protect Abu Dhabi from presumably Iranian missiles. But what that also means is that Israel has had an early warning station, not just on Jabal al-Sheikh, but in Jabal Ali, so much closer to Iran than Jabal al-Sheikh is. And this is an alliance. This is not just a secret relationship. What the status quo in the Arab world being strengthened has done is to enable the Emiratis to come out and make this all public. Now, let me just conclude by saying, many of you are social scientists who are studying the present and are trying to understand these shifting developments as they occur. I'm a modern historian, and I'm interested in how the past and the present.
Your 1 minute.
I'm almost done. How the past and the present relate to one another. I don't think that what I've talked about is the end of the story. 1848 slowed, but it did not stop the march of democracy in Europe, or of social policies that advantage many elements of the working class. We're going to see if something similar happens in the Arab world. I actually don't doubt that it will. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rashid, and thanks to everyone. We have, of course, our co-organizer who is going to conclude this panel, Amaney Jamal. I'd like to thank everybody in advance because I think we're going to have to make a swift shift to the next panel after Amaney concludes her presentation, because we are hitting, basically we're about 3 minutes behind. So we have emailed our speakers for the next panel and informed them that we will be 5 minutes behind. So we are starting the next panel at 2:35 p.m. Eastern Standard Time as opposed to 2:30 p.m. And we have also informed audiences on Facebook. So we are good in that regard. Those of you who would like to join us, shut up. Those of you, this thing's trying to shut me up. Those of you who would like to join us for the second panel, please go to the fresh link that will be posted in about literally 10 minutes. Amaney, I would like to add my voice to everyone here to thank you for your energy, your intellect, and your resolve in working to put this together. And I'd like to give you the floor to share your comments.
All right. Thank you so much, Bassam, and thank you all very, very much. It's a real honor and privilege to be presenting and co-presenting with all of you here. And I sort of feel like after hearing from all of you, there's not much more to say. So some of what I'll say probably be like summarizing some key points. But for me, as somebody who spends some time thinking about the Arab uprisings, their aftermath, and where we're sort of heading in the Middle East, there's sort of like 4 points that I often think about in terms of thinking about the effect or the overall effect of the Arab uprisings. The first is the issue that sort of just came up with Rashid's presentation, and then I think several others, which is the issue of time horizons. I remember following very closely the events of Egypt right after the Arab uprisings, and almost within 6 months of the collapse of the Mubarak regime, people were sort of talking about the failed revolutions. 6 months, when in fact most sort of revolutions or transitions take years and decades to solidify. And so the fact that commentators and spectators and even academics, including ourselves, were quick to dismiss the accomplishments of the Arab uprisings, I always found that sort of dissatisfying as an academic and as a scholar. And one of the questions I think we need to really ask ourselves, like, why was this the case? Why was it, in terms of thinking about how we studied the Arab uprisings? I mean, who ever thought that you were going to have mass mobilization on the streets of the Arab world, and then the next day you would have full-fledged democratic institutionalized systems overnight grow, when all democratic systems took years, if not centuries, to sort of form and solidify. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think about is, and this sort of I always like to pitch to policymakers, but never really goes anywhere, is the following. The one thing that I think we can agree on in terms of thinking about all the protest movements across the region around the Arab uprising and since the Arab uprising, and I'm going to share a screen here, is this is data from the Arab Barometer. Everybody can see it, right? Is this issue of economic grievances, right? We know that the Arab region, despite the natural wealth that it's been endowed with, still is a region that struggles economically. We can talk about the historical roots of this and what's going on. But the fact of the matter, outside of, this is the Arab Barometer data, wave 5, outside of Kuwait, which is a classic frontier state, no country can say that more than 50% of its population say the economy is good. I want to draw your attention just to Tunisia. This is the poster child, quote unquote, success story of the Arab uprising. And in 2018, only 7% of the population say the economy is good, a decade after the Arab Spring. If we look at the trend across MENA in the last decade, the trend has stayed static. For the adult generation, only a quarter of all citizens of MENA say the economy is good. If you look at the youth population, it was 33% in 2009. There was more optimism. Today, that is 2019, 25%. So this is on the decline. And one of the things I wonder is, like, which countries have ever come in with tremendous aid or economic packages to help Tunisia in the aftermath of the Arab uprisings? We've never heard about that. So this is just curious. Really quick, this of course is going to have a direct effect on how citizens view democracy. In MENA, about a third of the population, it's been stable across MENA, believe that democratic systems might not be effective. But look at Tunisia. This is the poster child. In 2011, 20% of the youth and 15% rejected the idea that democratic systems are not effective, or they only agreed with this idea that democratic systems are not effective. Today, 2019, which is about 2 years ago, this has probably been exacerbated today, almost 46% of the youth believe democratic systems are not effective, and 40% of the adult population. So it's not like you had this political culture of a democratic deficit in Tunisia, but after a decade with these tremendous economic challenges, this is what we see today. My last point is that I wanted to talk about the Arab uprisings, is that if we were to take, and I know all of you cautioned us not to do this, but if we had the democratic playbook before us, and we look at democratic transitions that emerge from citizen dissatisfaction and citizen grievances against the regimes, the citizens in this account played the democratic card the right way. They went out to the streets, by and large, they mobilized in nonviolent ways, they collectivized, they worked with one another despite all the hurdles and obstacles. And then it came to the elites. What are the elites supposed to do in this democratic moment? This is their moment to sort of respond to citizen demands. And so if we think that there is a failure that's linked to the Arab uprisings, we need to look and examine the role of political elite across our societies, because it's there that we see a lot of failure and basically this movement to sort of reverse this. So I still maintain that on the citizen side, the Arab uprisings have been a remarkable success. The fact that we haven't seen the outcomes linked to it that we sort of anticipate is maybe a failure of political leadership. And this is where we need to look at, well, then how, because in the democratic playbook that came out of Europe, the political elite had to succumb to the interests of the citizens because they were beholden to the citizens. Unlike the political elite of the Arab world, where most of them are not beholden to the interests of the citizens. They are beholden to, as was pointed out, to external, most often or not, external interests. So this is another thing. The last point is there was such an effort, and I'm just going to be very quick and to the point. With the Arab uprisings, there was such an effort to downplay the role of external intervention and the Palestine issue as causes of mass discontent. It was like, nobody cares about Palestine. Nobody cares about you. That's not true. I just want to show you something here. When we ask people, what is the primary threat to stability in the Middle East? 37% still say it's the state of Israel. And this is directly linked to the state of Palestine and the issue of Palestine. So the fact that, and when you think about who was on Tahrir during the Arab uprisings, remember, Tahrir becomes very dominant in Egyptian protest movements after the 2006 incursion in Gaza, where Egyptians flocked to the streets, after the US invasion of Iraq, where citizens flocked to the streets. So this idea of external intervention that has proved very costly economically and politically and in a human sense, this is an ongoing phenomena across the region. And finally, my last slide, and I have to end. Do you think foreign interference affects political reform? Do you think it's an impediment to political reform? In every single country in the Wave 3 data, every single country, majorities of citizens believe that external intervention, foreign interference has hurt political reform in their countries. So when we think about Arab exceptionalism, we really need to think about its exceptional place in terms of how foreign interests continue to penetrate and manipulate some of the existing political landscape. Thank you so much. I know I'm out of time, and I appreciate your patience.
Actually, you're good, Amaney. This was excellent. You have another minute, but thank you for ending a little early because we are actually moving in about 2 minutes to the next panel, which is basically the panel number 2, addressing these same reflections with another group of colleagues, 8 of us, and Amaney Jamal will be the moderator, and we are going, as far as I understand, with the order that is listed, whereby it seems like I'm going first after Amaney introduces the panel. So within literally a minute, we are switching to the second panel. You're welcome to share, to stay with us. Everyone here, the speakers, that is, are welcome to stay with us. You have a link, a specific link that you can click on. You will not be visible to the audience, but you will be sort of in your Zoom room, and you can listen to all of the discussion or watch it on Facebook. Thanks to everyone, all 8 of you, and I really hope that we continue this conversation. Shukran jami'an. Salam.